Spartans! What is your profession?
All right, time for another coat. And we're going to use the same amount as before. One difference is we're going to put some Sig Pigs silicone pigment in there. All right. Now one difference is that we can, what I like to do is put the Sig Pig in when I put the B in, the first part in. Mostly because that's the color we want to affect. The white part, you're going to get a color change, but what you want to see is how much the orange is going to change. Because that's the one you want to affect the most. So I get myself a toothpick, put a little in there. A small amount, it'll work pretty well. And you see, and you got, whoa. Don't worry, it won't, once you put the white in, it'll kind of wash it out a little bit. It won't be that bright red, but you do need to have at least a distinct enough difference between this color and that color to actually be worth putting it in. But as you can see, just a small amount of the Sig Pig, that little dab I took out with a toothpick, was enough to affect a lot of change. All right, so now let's put part A in of the 25 Rebound. And we're going to use the larger. And you can see when you're mixing it, you can see why you have to scrape it, because that stuff will really stick to the sides. So you really got to get in there and get a scraping motion on the sides of the container. It's a lot easier to check when there are two colors involved with the Sig Pig as to how much the mixing is going on. Do a little press down on the bottom, make sure that you're scraping the bottom up a little bit too. All right, want to go too far? After all, we do have a time limit, although we're only going to coat this part, so that'll go pretty fast, especially when you're doing a thick application with Thick Vex. You'll notice my pronunciation is a little wobbly sometimes. That's personal idiosyncrasies. All right, so put in about 3-4 drops. Usually when I have this amount, it usually works pretty good. That'll get the congealing effect of the, that's what I like to call it, the silicone and the Thick Vex. Usually you can tell right away after a couple of stirs whether it's catching or not. It's right on the edge of where I want it to be. Actually, I think I'm just going to go ahead. Let's make sure I've mixed it thoroughly enough, and I think I'm just going to apply it as is. You don't really need to go crazy with the Thick Vex, Start out very light, a few drops, depending on how big a container you have of silicone, and work up. Of course, if you have something that's going to have a very short pot life, you want to speed up how quickly you apply things. But take your time and identify high points and make sure that you've got them well covered. Of course, because of the way this one is, we're going to hit it up with another layer, and when we do that layer, I'm going to try and make check the bottom and see how thick the layer is. The bottom lip around needs to be a certain thickness, because it's very even. Once you got a good thickness, you know, one spot, usually around on the bottom, it should be even enough, since there aren't going to be very many high points. And if there is a high point or a low point, they're not going to be too drastic or too much of a problem. All right, now we got used up most of the stuff. Oh, another half hour and we should be good to go. Just checking, when you're doing silicone, make sure that you flatten out any little waves or lips or points. As when you're making your shell, or when you're making coats, you want to flatten out the mold as much as possible. So consecutive coatings will make it smoother and smoother, and you know, flatten out any high points or low points. You know, fill in the low points and flatten out the high points. Your last coating will look more like a homogeneous blob or block, and without any real variations. All right, we're gonna let this fellow sit for, yeah, get that stuff all over you, John. We're gonna let this guy sit for 30 minutes, and we'll be back to finish him up, at least for the silicone layer. Oh, before we go, now let's just do these guys. Now get my X-Acto, and we're going to that's it. I don't want this one to be like really, really thick. Yes. Okay. So, yeah, that was a very sloppy cut. All right. So you're thinking to yourself, that's a really long piece. But now you think you're going to, you know, put some silicone, and you're going to bury it about halfway. And then when you do the shell, you're going to bury it the other half onto the shelf, because you want this part, when you make the shelf, I'll show you later, but you want the top part to be flush, because when you're touching the mold later, the entire mold with the shell, you don't want to be pressing on these and pushing the mold. You don't want to press on these and push the mold back and forth inside of the shell. So that's got to be cut flush. So, you know, they're very unlikely to press or cause any pressure to move the mold. You want it in there to hold the mold in place. That's why it's got that slightly slanted cut to it, because you want it to pop into the shell, pull the mold with it, and flatten out the mold against the surface of the shell. Okay, it's kind of like a retention pin. Okay, let's cut off the other one. So these two are going to be the top nibs. Smaller, because I just want them to stick out here. I don't want them to be large because they're not doing as much work, just being little pins here to make sure that this doesn't wobble. Whereas this has to cover a larger area that it needs to pull into place. You'll put one here and you'll put one there. And that'll keep, you have to keep it the same distance here from here as from here to the next pin, as from there to there. So you're gonna, with your eyes say, about there. From red to blue. And that'll give us a totally different color for the final coating. All right. I know it doesn't look pretty, but it does work. Okay. Well, next will be the outer shell.